All right, welcome to the Coaching Collective podcast, episode 12. So today we are graced with the presence of Dean St.Mart from Ireland. So for those who don't know Dean is best known for his PCT model, which came out, probably published that a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah, it's been a
So
while.
long time ago.
Yeah. And these days has sort of expanded, went into the competitive field, and is now focusing on supplement needs, which is a supplement range which a large portion of my clients do utilize these days, which has been great. So without further ado, introduce yourself, Dean, and we'll take it away.
Yeah, so as you said, Michael, I'm Dr. Dean St.Mart. I have a background in drug design and pharmacology. And obviously I've taken that and applied it to bodybuilding. And then sort of a further interest was functional medicine, which is like how we look at the root causes of diseases,
Mm.
and taking functional medicine and pharmacology and applying it to bodybuilding, which no one had really done in the past.
Mm.
We knew steroids caused health adverse effects, but we never really got to the root cause of, say, why liver damage really occurred or
Mm.
cardiovascular disease occurred with anabolic steroid use. And taking the functional medicine approach of the root cause, so why do these compounds cause this damage and how can we offset that damage, is sort of what's brought me to where I am today with supplement needs, bodybuilding, even the PCT model that sort of came about, putting that engineering aspect to how does the problem occur and how do we fix that problem.
Mm-hmm. So what were you doing initially for work before you went into the supplement needs and into this kind of space?
Yeah, so after my PhD, I became a chemical engineer. So a lot
Mm.
of my sort of problem solving skills have developed from the PhD research and then applying that to chemical engineering.
Mm.
And then it just came to a point where I was at a crossroads of, do I continue being a chemical engineer, which I'd been for 8 years, or do I take this sort of leap and move into, supplement needs full time, which is being ran by my friend Lee. So um discussed it with my wife and then just made the leap of really progress, I guess, chasing after something that I'm really passionate about, that I know helps thousands of people daily. I'm
Mm.
really, I guess, chasing after, a dream of being this sort of forefront for making sure that bodybuilders stay healthy long term.
Mm-hmm. And obviously you've had your experience in competitive bodybuilding as well, which has motivated that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's how I met my wife. Morgan was through competitive bodybuilding, and I probably wouldn't be in this position, like even talking here today, if it wasn't for her. She was
Yeah.
the one that sort of pushed me into getting on social media and sharing what I know. And really, competitive bodybuilding was what introduced me to her. So it's not only brought me to where I am today with terms of my career, but it's brought me to the family that I have now.
Of course. Yeah, I've sort of been in a similar position because my partner's right into bodybuilding and it sort of sparks that for me. Yeah.
Yeah,
And without that, yeah, it's sort of, you sort of wonder where you would be. Mm.
exactly. Yeah. So obviously my sort of aspirations to competitive bodybuilding was always to win Mr. Ireland, win my class at Mr. Ireland. And that was achieved last year. So I was happy at the end of last year's competitive season to happily retire. I mean, this year I was 35 years old, so it was time to really start thinking of winding down a competitive career that spanned just over 11 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think when I first started following you, you were doing, it would have been the show before the last. And then you had a
Yeah,
little bit
yeah,
of a
it
gap
probably was
between, yeah, you had a gap between the two
that
as well.
that would have been 2017. That was probably when I was starting to get a bit popular on like Instagram, and after that the amount of followers I gained was just exponential.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was the last show, 2017, with my wife, and she finished competing that year, and we moved into obviously our family life. But the the competitive side of it, that show, I think I came fifth out of like 20 people. You're
Mm-hmm.
you're always sort of left, wondering, oh, your goal is unachieved. So I took whatever it was, 4 years, 5 years off. And then last year I said to her, I want to go back and really give it one last attempt to win, to prove to myself that I could. And obviously, yeah, it played off in my favor.
And obviously that was a positive experience throughout as well.
Yeah, completely different prep. Obviously, managing two young boys, managing like the couple of businesses and everything else. It was very interesting because it was completely different to previous years. Less training, less stress. Food was much higher. Just completely very positive competing experience, and at the end of it, then just happy to walk away and leave that life behind.
And you were obviously under Callum for that prep as well, correct?
Yeah. So me and Callum are very good friends, and that sort of relationship. I'm very critical and over analytic, so being able to hand over nutrition to Callum, and then training was taken care of by Aaron Casely. Just last year, just done what I was told, and like I said, I was training 4 days a week, stopping at like 2 reps in reserve, so never felt the effects of being tired on prep. My food stayed close to 3,000 calories, minimal PEDs. It was just a really positive experience that it was sort of bittersweet that your last competitive prep is the most sort of enjoyable and easiest one, where you sort of leave that competitive environment thinking if only it was that easy before.
That actually leads on to a question for me. When you were getting coached by Callum, were you running your own PED protocol, or did he have any input? Or
so you tend to be sort of like a working relationship. I tend to control a lot of it, but it's definitely nice that when you have a coach, it should really be like a two-way relationship where again, if the coach is more knowledgeable, then obviously you're seeking that coach's knowledge. But it's nice in this aspect that we can sound out approaches to one another. But it's always been the case for whoever I've ever dealt with. It's always been sort of a feedback relationship of a suggestion, and then sound reasoning, and then obviously implementation.
Yeah, and the other question I was going to say as well, are you still affiliated with ProCoach?
Yeah, so I come on board to Pro Coach last year, but officially joined last month as their health consultant. So obviously I've a good friendship with Callum, and I would have been sharing knowledge, backwards and forwards for different clients on my viewpoint. And then eventually decision was made that I'd be an exclusive health coach to all the coaches of Pro Coach, which again has been a dream come true, because you're overseeing hundreds of top tier athletes and being trusted with their blood work.
Oh, so you're doing the blood work analysis as well?
Helping with the blood work analysis, yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So were there any, like, we've got plenty to get through here, but was there any health specific reasons as to why you decided to sort of, I guess, retire from bodybuilding, or was it just more of a lifestyle conception kind of thing as well?
I think it was just more goal orientated. The end goal, regardless, had I won Mr. Ireland years ago, probably would have been the same, that I had no aspirations of being like an international level bodybuilder. I got to go to the IFBB European Championships in 2013 with Ireland from the IFBB organization. And that sort of opened my eyes to how competitive like top level bodybuilding is, especially in Europe, where a lot of guys I was competing against in the European Championship were actually amateurs, but sort of full-time funded bodybuilders by their country, which was incredible to see. But for me, some of the risks and all that, it's just, it wasn't, of what I wanted to seek out doing. So that was nice to experience, but it was never like, oh, I'm going to go back to the European Championships and win. It was sort of, okay, that was an experience. It's not really for me going forward, but the goal still remain of trying to win a national class. So when that was achieved last year, that was sort of the penultimate show of we done 2 warm-ups, gathered some data, and then really went, for the PCA Ireland show.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I had 3 more that I'd registered to compete in. So rather than pull out, we just plowed on through.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of interesting because it was pretty much 4 peak weeks, peaking 1 week after the next.
Mm-hmm.
But once it was sort of achieved, there was no real goal afterwards of, all right, I want to do that again. I think there has been, I guess, a self-affirmative side to it that, recently there's a part of you that wants to prove you can do it again.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side needs to be content that the goal was achieved as well. So, you can sort of see where people sometimes feel unfulfilled with achieving a goal or what's next. And I think planning ahead and knowing that once that goal was achieved, there was time to move on, and having, projects in place to put my energies into has helped that transition.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be that side of being a bodybuilder too. So I still train, I still eat healthy, still check in with Callum, still have a level of accountability, but there's no immediate focus of, oh, we're back into an off season of pushing up to like 105, 106 kilos.
Mm-hmm.
It's more so, again, having accountability to someone else, that maintaining a level of respectable condition, which obviously plays into healthy lifestyle, healthy body image, etc. That is like you probably see in my story, I still wear my trunks once a week so that I can get an accurate view of how my body composition looks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be very difficult. Like I even said this on a story, that it's going to be very difficult to remove that competitive persona away, where you're so used to doing a check-in once a week that you just stop, and you stop having that accountability. That for me, it's probably a habit at this point for so many years checking in, that you're gonna find it difficult to remove that controlling aspect. So it's definitely been a challenge, like I said, trying to move away from having to think, oh, I have to keep progressing my physique, to being content now where you're sitting. So you probably see my latest goal now, to sort of give me some sort of goal orientated process, is a 300 kilo deadlift. That's sort of my my current goal of keeping me entertained.
Yeah, because I have always said that when I decide that I don't want to do it anymore, I almost feel like you need a hobby which almost takes over, or like an interest. So like you going for that strength-based goal, like you see a lot of the guys go into functional training when they sort of throw in the towel, because it just completely shifts the focus. And without doing that, you're almost just fighting to not regress.
Of course.
That needs to be pulled away. Yeah, that's the hardest
doing
part.
something, but
like, I mean, you're always going to be involved with a gym as a bodybuilder, so it's just a matter, like you said, of figuring out what that focus is. And with some of the injuries I have from being a kickboxer before bodybuilding, some of the sort of functional fitness stuff gets removed with having to protect my ankles. So the strength-based goal of knowing that my sort of 1 rep max in a deadlift has been 270 with no sort of prioritization of deadlifting. Now actually having a structured plan in place for Aaron and building up like the amount of technique that's involved to a deadlift, to do a correct deadlift, has amazed me, with having to be so patient with what Aaron's been coaching with me to develop that proper neural pattern. That's not just a matter of brute strength. There's actually quite
off the floor.
There's quite a bit of technique to it. So when I sent him like my video of me pulling 270, he was like, you just brutally lifted that with your back. There's like no leg drive, no bracing. And so it's been interesting. It's been a bit frustrating. So obviously you're like deadlifting 140 for like doubles and triples. But now I'm starting to see where that neural pattern of you sort of just fall into bracing and falling into that leg drive, how technical strength sports are as well.
Of course. So with the supplement needs as well, I heard you say before that was it not initially your brand, or?
No, so Supplement Needs was started by Lee, and I became friends with Lee over the years through. He was a retailer for a couple of different brands of supplements. And that was sort of around the time when, about 2017, when I did start to become a bit more vocal and post more stuff on Instagram. Lee approached me and said he was launching his own line of supplement needs supplements. And I just gave him, you know, some basic ideas of what I felt were great products, and we sort of developed a, you know, working relationship there. And it started off with sleep stack, and then it progressed to liver stack, kidney stack, heart stack, and then before you knew it, the line, there was like 60 different supplements to the line. So it's been very interesting. Like, it started off, like I said, as a hobby when I was a chemical engineer, just doing it as something on the side. And like, even when I was like speaking on Instagram over the last few years, that's all been as a hobby. It's never been as an agenda to earn money or to get followers to, you know, buy into some agenda. It's literally just been, here's my experience, here's some knowledge that I've learned, passing it to whoever, you know, follows me. If they want to implement it, so be it. Brilliant.
Yeah, because it's, for those not aware as well, they're listening, like, it's probably one of the only products available of its quality and kind.
It's very thought out as well.
We have to ship it into Australia with, like, the shipping's like $50-$60.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, you need to somehow get it here without us costing up the ass for a postage.
Yeah, so we buy directly off the Sup Needs website. Yeah, because obviously it's quite difficult, but it's difficult to find anything of that quality without buying the products individually. And then when you do buy the products individually, you either have gaps or you have to break the bank account. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I joined, like, so when me and Lee when I started to develop the products with Lee, one of the things that was paramount to me sort of endorsing the brand to begin with was we'd never cut corners. So there'd be never any proprietary blends. Everything would be fully disclosed. And if we were going to do it, cost would never really be a factor in our decisions towards making a product. So, like, you can see, a lot of our products are premium based, but with that, we've not cut any corners towards, you know, liver stack, for example. You'll be very hard pressed finding any sort of product on the market that has vodka dosed at 800 milligrams per serving. And so, you know, from a manufacturing cost perspective, we appreciate, obviously, the cost is going to be higher. So the retail cost is going to be slightly higher than a regular competitor. But for the consumer then to understand that, okay, I can pay $30 for a product that's maybe dosed with 200 milligrams of Tudka, or you can pay $45 for liver stack that has 800. So we've sort of taken the approach that, yes, our blends are of a premium set point, but we've also tried to make it as affordable as possible to the customer for what they're getting in the products as well. And that tends to be a critical decision point when I'm formulating, in that I want to put as many things in as possible that are beneficial, with keeping a sort of normal price point in mind, that the consumer's getting both the benefit of a highly efficacious product, but also getting a reasonable price that caters to I guess, more so premium budget. Obviously, our brand wouldn't be aimed at someone who's, you know, young and starting their journey, where, you know, disposable income might not be the highest. So they should be, you know, putting their money into food and their training, etc. But obviously, as we get older and we start to, you know, take part in, you know, maybe, I guess, activities towards PEDs that will mismanage our health, then obviously supplementation plays a big part there in making sure that our health is kept optimized.
Yeah, because admittedly, back to one of the previous point, the Tudcat and the Astrag route, to buy them in themselves are as much as the products which you're selling.
Yeah.
And they're, from what I've seen and anecdotally and heard from individuals as well, like, the effectiveness is quite good, which is obviously what you want to see. And every base is covered, which you don't get with other products. And people will stinge because they have to take 12 different products. If you get a normal person to have to take 12 different tablets, it doesn't happen consistently. So
yeah, I mean, that was one of the things, obviously, the sort of foresight I had of the brand with Lee was you had one supplement store, because obviously this is me coming from my competitive background. I was buying all these sort of ingredients off different retail websites, and it was just becoming such a pain that, okay, I get this from this website and I get this supplement from Amazon, and you're just picking and choosing where you're getting these things from. That was just logistically a nightmare, because you'd order something and it wouldn't come for a few weeks. And eventually I thought there has to be a better solution of, you have one website that caters for absolutely everything organ health wise, but also is catered that they're dosed efficaciously, but also, like you said, that Heart Stack has 15 ingredients. CB Stack, you're just taking 6 capsules out of that tub per day, as opposed to having 15 individual products for your heart health. And again, that was, that was personal experience of before supplement needs. I'd be buying these 16 ingredients and having like once a week fill up pill boxes of taking out one from each tub. It was just so time consuming. And you can see where people either get fed up and don't take them, or just don't commit to the process of investing the money in taking a supplement. So that's been a big driver in making supplementation that's again of high quality and that's standardized dosing to what scientific literature says, more accessible to people, and of it, I guess, an easier way of keeping the compliance of taking the supplement.
Yeah, I was going through a lot of the supplements earlier, and you can just tell how well thought out a lot of it is, and a lot of the like dosages and all the ingredients that go into a lot of it. So it's just one of those things where we're probably a little bit far out for something like that to be readily available for a lot of people here. So it just makes it a little bit more difficult in that end. But
it's still available if you want it here. I still purchase it, and I still have clients purchase it. But I do remember, like you mentioned before, the Sleep Stack, that was the first one which I invested in. And I was like, it's because the ingredients that were in it, I understood it. It was disclosed. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm not doing anything. Because, you'd sometimes you take the sleep supplements, you buy one from the shop and you take it the next morning, you wake up, you're like what was in that? And you don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Sleep Stack sort of came about from when Lee was launching the initial line of supplements, and I was giving feedback. One of them was like ZMA. I was like to him, because I was working as a shift chemical engineer. I said to him, I've got this like sleep stack, if you want to call it that, of 6 ingredients that I take personally. And again, that was developed to support my sleep with night shifts and day shifts. That I said to him, I believe this is going to be really popular in terms of it not being a sedative. So it's actually playing on your body's own biochemistry to get you to fall asleep and stay asleep. And I think that was a hard concept for when we launched it, for people to understand that. I had people messaging me saying, oh, I took Sleep Stack and it done nothing for me. And you delve a little bit further, and their basically their sleep hygiene of what they're doing before bed is completely skewed. So their dopamine, their brain is sky high. They're like ramped up, where they're really, their brain is in an excitatory state where they're not going to fall asleep. And as soon as you sort of explain to them about the sleep hygiene, how to get their brain into a more calm, relaxed state, that's when they start to see the magic of the Sleep Stack, really take over and getting them to relax, fall asleep, and then stay asleep.
Yeah, what you just described is like the people that just come in to get supplements and they think it's going to be this magic thing, but it's like you have to nail everything else. You have to nail everything else before you're doing that. Like, it's not just going to zonk you out.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's why I didn't want with sleep. Like, you could easily put ingredients into a sleep product like valerian, hops powder, all these sort of sedative based ingredients that work on basically just telling the brain to shut off, like GABA and stuff like that. But to me, you're not actually putting the brain through the correct sleep pathways of increasing serotonin, increasing your body's own melatonin. That, to me, it just, I don't want to make supplements that give people a false sense of something working, like if that makes sense. I mean, there's several ingredients on the market that sort of give you a false sense of a product working when it's not really. And a lot of fat burners will contain ingredients that induce sweating, but sweating doesn't really mean fat burning.
Mhm.
A lot of, general base population will view sweating as doing harder work, really, and then the products magically work, and when it's not really. So I've never bought into making
I was about to say,
supplements
come to
that.
think of that, you don't have a fat burner, do you?
No, well, the closest one that we've made is thyroid stack. So again,
Yeah.
thyroid stack
Mhm.
was played around increasing your conversion of T4 to T3, so you're making more the active thyroid hormone. It's helping support the brain's production of thyroid stimulating hormone. So again, you're stimulating the thyroid to make optimal amounts of thyroid hormone. And then we put a couple of ingredients in that help with the browning of white fat. So effectively, you're converting your fat cells to a more metabolically capable cell of burning adipose tissue. Like fat burners, test boosters, these are really supplements that I could never formulate from a perspective of it's such an easy sell to someone,
Mhm.
but they don't really work. I mean, lean GBB, for anyone that's listening, if you see a fat burner with lean GBB in it, you're going to sweat. Effectively, how it works is it just increases the thermogenic capability of your body, so it induces sweating. But again, just because you sweat doesn't mean you're burning more fat. So I could never play on someone's sort of insecurities to making supplements that have no, I guess, backed clinical data or efficacy. Like, I mean, a test booster, your body makes testosterone from your Leydig cells being stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Just very little clinical data showing, natural supplements which induce higher levels of LH, which would mean you'd make more natural testosterone. What a lot of them do is they increase the production of adrenal testosterone, but in males, that's only, 5, max 10% of your natural testosterone production. So you will see an increase in total testosterone on blood work from using these supplements, but it's so marginal. You're talking 2-3 nanomole testosterone production being increased that I couldn't make supplements or formulas that are just playing off, fool's gold.
Do you see a place for testosterone boosters in like guys who are hypogonadal post testosterone use?
I don't tend to really recommend them. Stuff like, obviously, ashwagandha, some people purport that has some evidence towards improving natural testosterone, probably more so from a cortisol lowering perspective, in that you're diverting adrenal hormones away from cortisol to adrenal testosterone. That, there's been, the supplement industry tends to be a very cyclical industry in terms of how supplements are cycled through it, based on, a couple of influencers hyping up a product and then people hopping on the bandwagon, and then all of a sudden just that supplement fades into obscurity, and then someone else, hypes it up again. And we're sort of seeing that recently with like Fidogia, Tongat Ali or Long Jack. These aren't new supplements. These have been around for like decades. But it's sort of like, someone hypes it up, shows a bit of clinical data that's generally from animals, and people buy into it. Even this year's fad, like I said, or sort of the end of last year's fad, was like Tongat Ali, Fidogia. Before that, it was ecdysterone, with the sort of animal rat models of, this improves, lowering estrogen synthesis and improving testosterone utilization. It just, when you start to get clued into the supplement industry, you start to see like who's in it to earn money and who's in it to actually improve people's health. And, being someone who never relied on what we're doing with supplement needs to be like a level of income and it being a passion, I never had to have that viewpoint of being a sort of business of taking people's money. And that's sort of where the core value of our company, again, is, consumer health first, and sort of business model and profit model making, etc., being sort of the after effect of serving the customer.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I do Tonkat Ali. I actually have clients come to me and I ask, are they using androgens? And they'll say, oh, I was using Tonkat Ali, and it's like, doesn't count. Like, it's just that's the extent that it's reached with what people think the effectiveness of something like Tonkat Ali is. For Doja as well, I have seen good reports of it, and not that I bought into it, but I do like to. Personally, obviously, I'm using TRT, but so it's redundant to me. But a couple of clients thought, well, put some Doja in. Let's have a look and see if we observe any differences. Zero. But you not research it. You look online at reviews, and some of it's, well, ridiculously far-fetched, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, me personally, my natural testosterone level is hypogonadal at 8.
Yeah.
I've tried everything and done blood work, tried every single natural test booster you can search for on PubMed, and done anecdotal data collection. Obviously, it's N equals 1, but never moved above 8, never impacted LH. So, to be honest, if none of it worked for me, why would I try and develop something that's going to work for someone else? Like, to be honest, a lot of it is hype, and it's marketing hyperbole. People buy into the marketing aspect of looking for. Again, it falls down to what's more sexy, taking a supplement or optimizing your lifestyle parameter. You know, here's a bottle, take 1 tablet a day and your testosterone is going to increase, as opposed to cut out your junk food, exercise more, sleep, get better sleep quality. You know, we're in this sort of society, even with medication, that taking a medicine is normally the preferred route than actually improving lifestyle, where the dysfunction actually came from in the first place.
Yeah.
Yep, 100%. So that takes me to, we're sort of jumping a point here. So 8 nanomolar, your natural testosterone production.
Yeah.
So you're obviously on TRT now?
So I've optimized my test level. Yeah, you could say that.
Yep, optimized. Okay. So obviously one of the things that I mentioned that I want to talk to you about was in regards to optimizing your hormone panels. And you noticed quite a nice little flat line of your health markers, correct?
Yeah, so everything is optimal.
Yeah.
And this is sort of where I try to get guys to view that when you're using TRT, depending on your natural test level of where you're moving it with TRT, effectively you could be running a super physiological level cycle. I mean, put into perspective, going from 8 nanomole up to mid-range physiological, so even 20 to 25, you've effectively tripled your natural testosterone. That in theory is the exact same as someone at 60 at 20 going to 60. So going from 20 nanomole, taking 300 milligrams of testosterone and pushing that level to 60, they've tripled their natural testosterone. So I try and get guys to view that, when you use TRT, this excuse of like not being able to build muscle tissue or have a respectable physique with TRT is rubbish.
Of course. So to carry on from what I was mentioning, so you obviously optimized your hormones, and then you decided to discontinue the hormones for conception, was it?
Yeah, for fertility. And that again was sort of where my interest in PCT peaked from going into that first experience of I want to do this as optimal as possible. And then I started to read a bit more into the literature, and that was where the implementation of the aromatase inhibitor came into the power PCT. I was fortunate I got to have good conversations with Dr. Scally through Facebook, and I used to, message him and pick his brains on things. And the power PCT model is superb, but it sort of fell by the wayside of Chinese whispers. So Dr. Scally never ever said start your PCT after 2 weeks of your last injection. And he wrote a lovely article, you can search for it online, where he discusses the the limitations of like blanket statement of I've never ever said start your PCT after 2 weeks. It was always got to do with where your hormone profile has fallen to and then reinitiating the HPTA.
So for those listening,
So
what is the Power PCT?
So your Power PCT is 2,000 IUs of HCG every other day for 20 days. And then you move into a SERM therapy, a selective estrogen receptor modulator therapy, involving clomiphene or clomid, and a potential use of a secondary SERM, tamoxifen or Novadex. So I guess the pharmacological model of how these compounds work is extremely sound. But the timing aspect and the implementation aspect was never really properly communicated. So on one instance, when you take exogenous testosterone or TRT, you shut down the male HPTA. So that male HPTA is the hypothalamus pituitary testicle axis. Your hypothalamus produces a stimulating hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that stimulates the pituitary into producing your two fertility hormones, LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. When you take exogenous testosterone, it shuts down that sort of natural feedback loop.
So, and then obviously go on.
No, I was going to say, but more so, it's the elevation in your estrogen. When you take an exogenous source of testosterone, that shuts down the brain. So the brain has these neurons that sense in your testosterone level, or more so your estradiol level. And once it goes above your baseline, the hypothalamic secretion of the stimulating hormone drops. So the pituitary is no longer being stimulated to make your two fertility hormones. When we cease the use of TRT or anabolic steroids, effectively what we should do is be patient and let these drugs clear so that the hypothalamus has a clear playing field to see what's going on in a natural physiological setting. And most often than not, the guys who are patient and let these drugs clear, so depending on the ester that's attached to the drugs, this can be 5, 6, or even 10 weeks if you're stupid enough to use nandrolone decanoate or baldanone undecyclinate. So if you're taking DECA or EQ, you're looking at like 10, 12 weeks for these drugs to fully clear. But if you follow this sort of intelligence clearance period, most often than not, for most guys, their hypothalamus will sense this drop in hormone level and restart the HPTA. So there's no need for most people to utilize pharmaceutical drugs to reinitiate the HPTA. The patient aspect tends to pay off. And then you can support the HPTA, I guess, reinitialization with a SERM, which will effectively amplify how much LH you make from your brain to speed up the recovery process. They might not need HCG. And I've seen so many people ruin their naturally restored HPTA by putting HCG into the system without understanding what's going on. And my viewpoint was be patient, let 5 weeks or 6 weeks pass, get your bloods done for your testosterone, your LH, and your FSH. Once you have that data, you can make a really good decision on whether you need PCT drugs or whether you just need patience because the system is restarted by itself. If the system doesn't restart by itself following the clearance of the compound, then yes, what we look to do here now is jumpstart the system. And that's where the sound reasoning of HCG comes in, because it is an LH mimic. So it artificially tells the Leydig cell of your testicle, initiate steroidogenesis, start making natural intratesticular testosterone. Once the testicle has made that natural testosterone, although it's artificially being produced by your HCG, it goes back to the hypothalamus. Obviously, in the hypothalamic neurons can sense that there's a low level of testosterone, more so a low level of aromatization. Again, this was sort of where then my take on it was, let's implement an aromatase inhibitor so that when the HCG initiates testosterone production, we're not going to lose it to estradiol. So we're blocking that aromatization to make sure that whatever the HCG stimulates stays as testosterone, goes back to the hypothalamus, stimulates it to start producing gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that initiates then your own LH and FSH production. And then obviously once that LH and FSH production is up and running, it tends to take, the 10 shots of 2000 IUs, which is 20 days of HCG. We get bloods to again verify, has the hypothalamic and pituitary part of the HPTA start to function again? So do we see an increase in LH and FSH? And if we do, then we can stop using the HCG because the system is basically up and running by itself, because you've jump started the battery basically. And then what you're looking at is stabilizing the pituitary now to output more LH, because obviously the more LH you produce, the more testosterone your testicle can produce. And effectively, that's where Clomid comes in. Clomid acts as an estrogen agonist, so it acts like estrogen to tell the pituitary output more LH, but it also acts as an estrogen antagonist, and that it blocks estradiol's effects at the hypothalamus and pituitary as well. So it has two effects in stabilizing and amplifying the HPTA. And that was sort of where my view is, take a data-driven approach to your PCT, almost taking that sort of engineering background where why make decisions without data?
Of course. Because
again, data is always going to be key to what you want to do on a decision basis, or just blindly follow what someone has said on the internet of, here's your PCT protocol, follow that. And to be honest, I've seen so many failed PCTs on the Train by JP forum when I was on there, that I just got fed up. And it was always the same pattern. When you start your PCT, 2 weeks after my last shot. Okay, what was your cycle? 500 EQ, 500 tests. Well, to start, the EQ is still in your system. And it's probably still in your system now because you're only 7 weeks post PCT. So it came to a point where I felt, okay, I've done my own research to my own PCT restoration. The data was there to prove that the protocol worked because I documented all this. And I just felt, I'm just going to put this on YouTube with, 2 detailed paragraphs, all the academic references. Some of the stuff too has changed because obviously that was sort of the first time where I was getting used to producing content in front of a camera. So some of the protocol has slightly changed over the years, but the basics to it is there on YouTube for free. And obviously when it was released, after a while I was getting DMs of people saying, oh, they're tearing this apart in this forum and whatever else. And it was sort of I don't really care if you're going to try and tear this apart, because it's a protocol that is there to follow if you want, and if you don't want to follow, fine. There was no, like I said, there was no selling point to, you watch the video and then it's like a baited funnel into purchase this product or whatever. It was just, here's some data, here's all the references, here's a protocol that takes a reasonably sound model that was there before for PCT and just adds another layer of being patient, getting your blood work done at the end of the clearance, seeing do you need PCT, and if you do need PCT, the other added layer was the aromatase inhibitor use during the HCG to ensure that the testosterone stayed as testosterone.
There was it's almost, I find it interesting because with the model, it's you can't really refute it. So it's almost like the individuals become triggered because they realize that what they've been doing for so long is wrong, and something that they have been preaching for so long is wrong. Because I've got a few notes down here as well, but it makes no sense to bring in that kind of stimulation when there's still androgens in the system, which is suppressing. And
exactly, yeah.
That does not take a mastermind to recognize that. So half-life of what is the half-life of test D? 5 or
5 to 7 days.
Yeah, 5 or 7.
That's getting into you're getting into the nitty-gritty that someone can be a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. So on average, we just go, right, 5 to 7 days. If in doubt, I always say just go to the sort of the longest time, and that's 7 days. Multiply that by 5, and you get 35 days. So, so you're looking at 5 weeks, 6 weeks. To be honest, going out to 6 weeks isn't going to be the end of the world on whether you implement HCG or not. Obviously, one of the things that I critically argue against is HCG use when on cycle. And
I have that written down here. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. And I keep getting the same arguments over and over again of, we should be stimulating the testicle with HCG when we're on cycle. And to be honest, you have to view what is HCG doing in the body. And like I said, acts as LH, acts on the LH receptor of your testicle and stimulates intratesticular testosterone production through steroidogenesis. So it can make sense on one aspect that if you're going to be on TRT for life, so if you're starting from being really, hypogonadal, clinically hypogonadal to TRT, starting a very low dose of HCG long-term without going to the supraphysiological levels of TRT use or testosterone or anabolic steroids, that HCG stimulation will, in theory, create a small amount of intratesticular testosterone that can help the Sertoli cells' androgen receptors with sperm proliferation. Not to a huge extent, but it will preserve some level of fertility. But your fertility is still going to drop because your FSH is going to be suppressed.
In doing that, would you see any risk of damage to the Leydig cell at all across the long term? Or would that not matter because you're on TRT essentially for life?
Again, the Leydig cells get more so damaged through oxidative stress. So it'll really depend on what's happening to the system overall. That small level stimulation of a small dose of HCG daily with TRT use, it will preserve testicular size because the Leydig cells never atrophy because they're being stimulated to produce all the substrates that come with steroidogenesis. But in my view, HCG is best saved for when you need to jumpstart that battery. So if you're constantly putting small amounts of LH stimulation into the system, when it comes to actually the time when you need to get that system up and running, it's almost like you're just drip feeding in the substrate that when it comes to having to really spike it to get it going, your body's just not going to respond to the same extent of if it never had that stimulation to begin with. And that's where using HCG on cycle, in my opinion, just should be saved for when you need to use HCG. And that's if the HPTA doesn't respond to the removal of the drugs, we can falsely stimulate the testicle into producing testosterone with an elevated amount of LH. Obviously, one of the things that often comes up is Leydig cell desensitization, which can occur, but it tends to occur in older males in that the down regulation of the LH receptor on our testicle does decrease with age, and that's where we sometimes see late onset hypogonadism occur, where testosterone levels in males decreases over time. But from a cycle perspective, it's just one of these compounds that testicular size does not correlate to testosterone level also. So it's one of these, false paths of someone saying that if you're using HCG on cycle, you're maintaining testicular size, so it's not atrophying. And that leads to better recovery. And I tend to disagree because testicular size, they've done studies with testicular size correlating to testosterone level, and it's just not true.
Yep. So do you feel like you'd be risking any chance of desensitization with the 2000 units of HCG? Because obviously for some individuals that can be excessive, for some that can be correct.
It can. Again, we're trying to standardize what 2000 I use correlates to in a male's body in terms of that dose. And it tends to equate to in and around 1 to 2 IUs of natural LH. So you could argue there is a desensitization aspect from a high dose there coming from nothing, but it's been well documented high doses of HCG being used for quite significant periods of time without desensitization occurring. That receptor complex is a little different to other complexes in the body in that it doesn't tend to downregulate in response to the amount of LH it's being exposed to. It tends to be more so on a genetic level where the creation of that receptor complex deteriorates over time.
And my next question was as well. So obviously we're looking at the two. Let's say we do propose a 2-week break between discontinuing androgenics and bringing in the PCT, which obviously is flawed as we've discussed. And one thing I was going to add before, it doesn't take much to have a quick search on the internet to realize to completely clear the drug is roughly 5 times the half-life. So a PCT in that window makes no sense. Anyway, I'm also saying that for the listeners. With HCG, if you were to bring that in when, let's say, testosterone or equipoise hasn't cleared, would you be essentially pushing estrogen up higher with the introduction of HCG and then making that recovery even more difficult?
You certainly can. If you think about, if you're increasing intratesticular testosterone production, it can aromatize within the testicles. So yeah, you could be contributing to elevated levels of estradiol, which further again is going to shut down the hypothalamus. But again, it's more so the long half-life of these drugs that it's staying in your system way beyond that 2-week point.
Window.
I mean, you could be lucky and you're a fast metabolizer and that the half-life of the drug is essentially half. So in other words, you could have most of the drug cleared from your system in 3 weeks if you have these genetic polymorphisms within your liver enzymes that speed up the metabolism of testosterone. But you're talking like a rare case, very rare. I don't know the exact percentages in terms of the population, but it's very, very rare. And that would be the only time where you'd say, oh, well, I had success doing the 2-week last shot HCG, and it was effectively because you were a fast metabolizer and you timed the HCG correctly. But again, it comes back to, like I said, the whole patience aspect. Just get your bloods done and see, do you even need a PCT? That's the I guess the intellectual answer to is, do you need a PCT? And that's where the bloods come in. And if you do, great, there's the protocol there. And if you don't, even more so great. You just have to be patient, keep monitoring your bloods to make sure that the axis is staying stable for, say, 8 to 10 weeks, and then do whatever course needs be, whether you're staying off for fertility aspects or whether you're staying off long-term because you're done with taking these compounds. But I guess something that I've been just as vocal about is like androgenic steroid-induced hypogonadism, whereby you have someone who has recovered their HPTA fully and back to complete baseline HPTA function, but they're hypogonadal in terms of being symptomatic.
Yeah.
So for all intents and purposes, a general practitioner will look at the blood work and say, okay, total testosterone's at 20, FSH and LH are like 3 and 3 as well. So on paper, everything is green, all go lights, but that person has difficulty maintaining an erection, very poor mood dysfunction, difficulty concentrating. And we start to see that these compounds have neural effects on our neurochemistry. So it's not just a matter of returning the HPTA function of producing testosterone in normal amounts. It's also getting the brain chemistry back to a normal baseline. And we have to view that just like our brains having plasticity of being able to make more connections for us to help remember things better. It also has a level of you to not get into like really deep neurochemistry. Your brain basically operates on an electrical charge, and the neurons themselves pulse based on that electrical charge. The more neurotransmitters you produce, potentially the higher you push that voltage. So knowing that testosterone or androgens increase dopamine within your brain, you're effectively pushing that neural charge or that again voltage for your dopamine to pulse to a much higher level. So in theory, to sort of make a comparison, let's say your testosterone level was at 60 when you're taking androgens, your dopamine transmission is used to that androgen level being at 60. So when you've naturally restored HPTA function back to, say, 20 nanomole, that gated voltage is never getting to the same level as when your testosterone level was at 60. So all of a sudden, your brain's not making the same amounts of dopamine as it was when you were taking super physiological levels. And that neurochemical aspect is what is not educated on PCT. And that is one of the biggest factors to relapse, in that whilst these compounds aren't addictive physiologically, like other addictive substances where your body tells you have to take it in order to maintain the normal physiological state, from a neurochemical aspect, most people will relapse and use steroids again because of that poor libido and poor sexual function. Because they start to view that when I was on cycle or I was at a higher androgen level, I had none of this sexual dysfunction. And they're just further fueling this fire that for chronically, they're going to have to keep this elevated androgen level in order to feel normal, basically. Because their natural baseline, because of the neurochemistry involved in the neurotransmission, never came back to their natural baseline following the recovery of the steroid cycle. And that natural recovery of neurotransmission, there is no set period of time on how long it takes for those neurons to calm down. And what really, I guess, further instigates is we live in an environment where dopamine fuel activities are all around us. We're constantly checking our phones. We're constantly engaging in activities that drive dopamine, fast driving, all different things that really makes it difficult for the brain to actually calm down from that dopamine fueled environment that the androgens caused. So that is definitely one side that I've become really vocal on and trying to get guys to understand that restoring the HPTA is relatively easy. It's restoring the physiological processes that comes from having that elevated androgen level that's more difficult. The neurotransmission is just one side. There's other sides to metabolic processes like your glucose utilization, your fatty acid oxidation, where you start to see potential metabolic syndromes occur because your body's used to having this elevated androgen level that's activating all these genes that play into how you use carbohydrates, how you use fats, that when you go back to being natural, these cells are still looking for the androgen receptor to activate these gene responses. So you do start to see issues with, I guess, metabolic rate, thyroid dysfunction, increased fat gain, elevated blood pressure. You start to see all these manifest in people who you would deem are relatively healthy because of that, I guess, lower androgen level to when they were on cycle.
And in regards to potential strategies to mitigate those kind of side effects, that was one of the things we were really hoping to touch on today, similar things to that. Would this be an argument for spending more time in sort of like a TRT phases for competitive bodybuilders and things like that? Or would this be a case of having to spend time completely off the androgens? And if there's any strategies that you would be aware of to preserve something like that?
Yeah, I mean, from the dopamine side of things, yes, it would be wise if you are a competitive bodybuilder to sort of bring that androgen level down to a physiological dose. I mean, that was one of the things that I tried to introduce, was the concept of like not blasting and cruising, but you're doing TRT and a cycle of super physiological levels of androgen. So for a period of time during the year, you're going to run a TRT phase where you're strictly mimicking being in that physiological range, so that physiological processes of the body can come back to normal. Very similar to if you ran PCT, because testosterone that's injected is bioidentical to what your body produces in your testicle. It knows no difference. So if you maintain a total testosterone level of 20 naturally versus 20 with TRT, it's the same, other than still your fertility is going to be impacted, but your body's processes are going to know no different.
Of course.
During that period of obviously TRT, you would probably try and fall back to a lower sort of dopamine environment. So again, it's very difficult because you're going from super physiological level of androgens where your libido is going to be sky high to a lower sort of set point where your libido is going to come with it. But if you still try and maintain that high libido sort of mentality, you're forcing your dopamine to be at the higher level. So again, it comes down to, exposure to porn, exposure to high risk activities, anything that's going to skew elevated dopamine in your brain. This is sort of where the concept of like dopamine fasting and putting protocols in place where you're really limiting your dopamine exposure within the brain in order to bring it back to a baseline, bring those neurons back to a normal resting point. Doing full PCTs for competitive bodybuilders, in my mind, is just, it's again a double-edged sword. On one hand, you're restoring HPTA function back to how you are when you're naturally. So again, you're restoring natural balance. But for most guys, if they do have to go through a pharmaceutical PCT, it's going to take 5 weeks of clearance and then potentially 10 weeks of pharmaceutical therapy. So you're looking at 16 weeks total PCT time. And then for what? To go back on cycle again once the HPTA is up and running. It just makes no sense to run through the misery of having a very low hormone baseline back to a sort of natural optimal baseline to then shut it back down again and push your level sky high again. Versus the TRT approach of, okay, you bring your total testosterone back to a natural level of where you would have went to with PCT and just sit there. So you're not experiencing any of the lows of a PCT. You're not experiencing any of the metabolic disruptions that would happen during the clearance period, potentially. And, fertility aspects aside, that's always going to be the one thing that guys actively have to accept responsibly when they start using these compounds, that fertility is going to be suppressed. So to me, the sort of cycle and TRT is the more optimal health path forward for a competitive bodybuilder who's going to partake in off seasons to competitive seasons. Where you have to view, just like with the PCT clearance, if you run a steroid cycle of 12 weeks, for example, of an elevated dose, depending on the esters again, you're going to have 4 or 5 weeks of clearance. So that elevated dose is going to take 4 or 5 weeks to come down. But more so, if you just start your sort of TRT phase on week 13 when you've stopped your cycle, your first sort of, like I said, 4 weeks of clearance, you still have this elevated androgen level from the cycle. So even in terms of approaching how long your TRT phase should be, you should have a 12-week cycle similar to a PCT, a 4 or 5 week clearance period. Whether you initiate your TRT dose or not during that 4 or 5 week clearance period is completely up to you. Just bearing in mind that if you start the TRT dose during that clearance period, by the time you reach week 5 of the clearance of your cycle, you're already running at a stable hormone level from where you would have been on cycle. And then giving yourself at least 8 to 12 weeks at that TRT dose to allow things like your lipid panel, your production of angiotensin too, that could have been skewed from your elevated testosterone. What are things? I guess you're going to lose a level of muscle mass in response to that lower androgen load. But again, the gains in health probably outweigh that, because again, with muscle memory, as soon as you go back to that super physiological dose, you'll regain most of that tissue that came off from going back to that physiological level. To me, that sort of like 12-week cycle, 4 or 5 week clearance period, and then start an 8 or 10 week sort of TRT phase. And at that point, get your bloods done, see as everything sort of normalized. Obviously, that TRT blood work doesn't give you a reflection of how your blood work was when you're on cycle. So it is wise that you do bloods when you're on cycle as well, so you can see what gets skewed. But you should have obviously a baseline of how your health should look when you're on TRT or at that physiological level as well. to allow you to guide, obviously, how your health moves forward.
Because the current perception of these concepts is that you don't need to. This is why I found these concepts so interesting. So obviously you've discussed in previous podcasts impacts on your own lipids, your own. Oh, well, I just remember it was majority lipids, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. So and now there's a little bit of the belief that you don't really need to go to a physiological range if you're in the middle of like a competitive bodybuilding kind of career, if your panels are good. But we have no idea what the impact of these androgens are having on these kind of levels. And I feel like there's no education and there's not really any strategies which are really rock solid anyway, which prepare us for stuff like this. But if you if you try to tell people these things, even those who are a little bit more recognized, they almost laugh at you. Not laugh at you, but it's just like that's not a thing, mate. And it's go on.
No, it is a little I guess frustrating that there is a level of dismissal or is a cognitive bias, but we even the cardiovascular disease risk reduction model, to me, this is sort of, again, where developing the CV or heart stack come in, was that, to me, the biggest sort of viewpoint that isn't discussed towards atherosclerotic disease is plaque formation through foam cells, through oxidized LDL. So whilst we're all focusing on the lipid panel being perfect in terms of all green, you can have an all green lipid panel, but you're still making sky high amounts of oxidized LDL, which is a direct contributor to atherosclerotic plaque production. So it tends to fall into then, what strategies are you putting in place to offset that LDL oxidation, which is effectively oxidative stress. And if you're putting strategies in play to prevent oxidative stress, you're not only protecting your heart, you're protecting the kidneys, you're protecting your Leydig cells and Sertoli cells from being oxidatively damaged. So you're effectively putting practice in as protecting the global body from the effects that these androgens do, and that is increase oxidative stress to the body. And again, oxidative stress leads to premature aging because we have cells that are effectively being targeted to die. And so you start to see there's other, I guess, a chain of effects that happens from that oxidative stress, let alone cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually saw you post a post about the external. What was it?
Your external agent gives you a reflection of your internal agent. And we see, like, it's really impressive. We see guys that put on like 30 pounds of muscle mass, like pure muscle mass, in the space of, like, I don't know, 15 months. Like within a space of 2 years, completely transformed their physique really impressively. But then we take one look at the face, and the face is aged about 10 to 15 years. To be honest, as impressive as it is, if your physical appearance has massively aged rapidly, it gives you a very good indication of what's happening at a cellular level inside. So if the cells producing your DNA are effectively being damaged and not being able to replicate as well as they should, in terms of your physical appearance or your collagen, blood vessels to your skin, some neurite elastin, everything that makes up sort of collagen of your face, if that has aged rapidly, then what about the myocytes of your heart? What about the nephrocytes of your kidneys? We've got all these things that physical appearance on the outside gives a good relative indication of your cellular health, of your age and capacity. And that's sort of where we know that activating mTOR is, in theory, an aging process. So the mTOR, which stimulates muscle protein synthesis, is an aging pathway because we're speeding up cellular replication. And effectively, with increased rates of cellular replication, there's increased potential for increased rates of error in the production of these proteins. And so obviously if we're making dysfunctional proteins, that can lead to dysfunctional mechanisms and dysfunctional disease. So long-term activation of mTOR can effectively reduce lifespan because of you're speeding up aging processes in the body. So bodybuilding as an overall can be viewed as an aging mechanism, but when controlled selectively, we know that building muscle protein tissue and connective tissue strength, nervous system resiliency, it can be anti-aging because it reduces risks of falls and everything like that, fragility when we get old. So it's when we're sort of young and we're abusing this pathway to gain massive amounts of muscle tissue that not only are you speeding up your, I guess, introduction to oxidative stressors through elevated doses of androgens, you're effectively speeding up your exposure to increased aging because you're activating this mTOR-C mechanism.
And just a question for you as well. Human growth hormone would play into these same processes, correct?
It would through IGF-1 conversion. Yeah, most definitely.
How is this considered anti-aging?
So that's
in the wider population.
Again, we're probably going to come from the lens of it being in a growth hormone deficient population, as opposed to implementing growth hormone in individuals who may not be growth hormone deficient. So if someone is growth hormone deficient, providing a physiological substitutive dose akin to T or T, you are effectively producing a hormone that gets converted to a more anabolic hormone, as to speak, through IGF-1. To again increase, I guess, connective tissue production, which again plays into them force strength in the skeletal. It's when you start to apply doses of growth hormone that might be used for human growth hormone replacement when that person isn't deficient, yes, you're going to increase the amount of IGF-1 they're producing. And that's different between males and females, obviously. But you're also increasing the risk of tissues that you may not want IGF-1 to be exposed to, such as tumor cells that would induce, obviously, cellular replication of a tumor.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, no, that whole process there with the aging concept as well, I feel like that's something that isn't acknowledged. But you do, obviously, if you look around a gym, as you mentioned with the bodybuilders before, you can typically see how much you get an idea of how ridiculous someone is being with androgen use just by looking at their face. Yeah. And that's very, very common. But also, yes, go on.
No, I was going to say, and it's just similar to virilization aspects in females who push the androgen load too fast or too high, in terms of like even vocal cord changes. There surely has to come a point where a male notices these physical trait changes in terms of their appearance and just chooses to accept that this is their reality, or we're gone to a complete like body dysmorphic society where just don't care what the face looks like. Everywhere else needs to be massive and big arms, big legs, whatever, big chest. So
I think that's what it is.
There can be a very, we're verging onto like even psychological disorders here, with the aging being a symptom of the use, but it's ignored by the person's own, again, bias that choosing to accept this is how they look. It's all very, very interesting.
It creeps up so slowly as well that it's hard to acknowledge.
Exactly, it is. It that can happen, but again, it's sort of, it comes to a point where you just accept that this is how you physically look now. But the unfortunate side of things that guys have to realize is, and like I said in that post about telomerase, which is what sort of increases your telomere length. When your telomeres shorten, these things protect the end of your chromosomes. And obviously your chromosomes contain your genes and your DNA. When that telomere gets critically shortened, it basically tells the body, okay, well, that's a dysfunctional cell. It can no longer replicate because the chromosome has been compromised. So the DNA that's inside that chromosome is now compromised. The body either ignores and sees that as a senescent cell. So it's just a cell that's pretty much aged and can no longer regenerate itself, or it's intelligent and it can send in killer cells and stuff like that to basically cause the cell to die and sweep it away and keep normal cellular replication happening from your other cells in the vicinity of it. But if your physical appearance is aged, when you cease androgens, there's probably going to be a level of reversal in that you might see some of the telomeres start to lengthen again because you're no longer inducing that level of oxidative stress that's causing your telomeres to unravel at a faster rate.
I have observed that though. Like a lot of individuals, once they stop, they look 5 years younger within 6 months. Yeah.
And that's what will happen. Things will reverse to an extent, but there is a level of damage that has been done then from that telomere shortening during that period of time, that when we see guys who have used anabolics, ceased them, and then they're having like issues with their health in their late 40s or 50s, like myocardial infarctions, we're having heart attacks. It's not unsurprising considering the level of cellular damage that was done in their, early 20s, late 20s, early 30s, that you're accepting that future risk, and that sort of physical appearance is giving you an indication of, okay, I'm doing levels of damage here that physically I can see on the outside. So what's happening on the inside?
Do you think when, like Michael was saying, when people come off and they start to look a little bit younger again, do you think that's a genetic factor that's in play, or do you think it's just?
I think it's just a removal of just stress on the body. I mean, you're again, when they remove androgens, most of the time they're sort of, their dietary practices fall back in line more so than a normal person. Their training capacity, they're no longer training to the same extent as when they were on. So you start to see a lot of lifestyle factors that would play into that aging process calm down a bit. So again, that's going to contribute into how environment dictates your genetics to a certain extent. But yeah, I can see a level of genetics. So again, if you're predisposed to faster aging from a genetic point of view, that you may not reverse some of this physical appearance and still maintain that aged appearance post-competitive life. But again, just like heart disease risk, that is a risk, unfortunately, that guys have to accept, is the aging aspect.
Oh, a lot of these concepts obviously are quite thorough for the general listener, but what the takeaway here would be as well is that your blood work can check out, your blood pressure can check out, blood glucose can check out consistently, ECG can check out, but this is how we run ourselves into a risk later in life. And it's sort of explained on that, I guess, cellular level, which obviously is not super popular because it is more difficult to understand, I would probably argue.
Well, it's like one of those things as well where it's like, I don't know if you guys have seen that meme with the iceberg, and it's like the iceberg's just got the tip out, but then it's like everything's sort of underneath it. And I feel like when people sort of go to start using anything, androgens, whatever, PEDs, they don't take into account what's here. They take into account just what's at the top. It's just sort of what they see and what they can sort of understand. They don't take into account what they don't understand, which is probably, if not more important.
Yeah, and I mean, there are aspects of this that even preaching 3D diagnostic work, so, getting angiograms or CT angiograms on your heart to check out the vessels of your heart. Of course, if a CT angiogram shows that there's no coronary plaque present, you've got a fairly good, I guess, risk of not having a heart attack within, say, 5 years if there's no coronary artery plaque present. But the sort of not morbid side to it is that you have no idea surrounding the genetics that's controlling your heart function, that, in 5 years' time, you could still have a potentially cardiomyopathy happen where cells in the heart start to become dysfunctional. That these are always going to be risks when we use these compounds, that it's not foolproof that you're going to be healthy long term. And that is something that needs to be always in the back of someone's mind using androgens and optimized androgens, even that we can do all these diagnostics towards. Your serum blood work tells you how healthy you are in that moment in time.
Mm.
Your 3D diagnostics tells you how healthy that organ is in that moment in time. And we're just extrapolating future health off those diagnostics. It's never, we can't ever say predictably your health is going to be perfect for the next 5 or 10 years because your blood work or your angiogram or your echocardiogram is perfect, that you're not going to suffer anything within the next sort of 5 to 10 years. We're always just extrapolating, using that data to give us a risk prediction based on what it's saying.
Yeah, and you'd say, so are you saying that this kind of data would not provide an indication for the next 10 to 15 years, and it's solely a snapshot?
So in terms of, say, an angiogram or an echocardiogram showing that your heart isn't enlarged or there's no coronary artery plaque present, that is a positive indication that it's highly unlikely that you're going to have issues in terms of, I guess, an enlarged heart and enlarged septum causing physical issues with your heart, or more so, again, if there's no plaque present or calcium present within the heart from your angiogram, that it's unlikely that there's going to be significant buildup of plaque within that artery within the next 5 years. So that gives you an idea of your heart attack risk, as to speak, contributed through a blood clot or through atherosclerotic plaque. But it doesn't weigh up, like we're getting into really cellular intricacies, that you could start to develop issues in terms of the genetics that's controlling the cells of the heart, as to speak, or any other cell in your body starts to become dysfunctional. So we're always making assumptions based on diagnostics we do, as opposed to giving us clear paths of, I guess, foolproof that we're healthy for the long term. And that's why it's so important that whatever health practices we put in place, through lifestyle, through diet and supplementation, that we upkeep them as we age to ensure that we're preserving our longevity.
Do you feel like if this information was a little bit more public, it would deter people from bodybuilding?
I very hard to say. I mean, there's aspects to bodybuilding that comes from a personal aspect, where someone gets into bodybuilding for personal reasons. And there's also then obviously the social gratification aspect of bodybuilding, where someone gets into it because of the social fame that comes from the physique that's sustained, or that is achieved through bodybuilding. So I guess for those who are getting into bodybuilding for more personal reasons are not skewed by social aspects, then yeah, this probably would make them think twice over what bodybuilding means to their longevity, and is it worth it, for especially from the enhanced perspective. For those that are getting into it, like from the social gratification perspective, probably not, because we're getting more into psychology, that there's there's an external motivation source in terms of extrinsic motivation, as opposed to that person themselves seeking bodybuilding for their own glorification. So probably, like I said, the ones that are getting into it more so for personal reasons will take on board, how their future health may be impacted, and those that aren't, probably more so not.
Yeah, there's sort of there's two perspectives to it, because these kind of factors can't be predicted either.
No,
not at all. They can't be predicted. They can't be managed. So I guess they can be managed to some degree, but not to the extent that we'd really like. But so if you were to present this kind of information anyway, because to be fair, I haven't heard this kind of information really anywhere. I'm not too sure if there'll be other resources from, like, with this kind of.
No, and this is something I've never really discussed on a podcast. This is just, even just
because right now I'm sitting here like mind blown, like, out of my depth.
But to be honest, I would try and not think about, obviously, when you do all these 3D diagnostics and you're predicting future health, You're effectively really, putting your mind at ease towards, okay, this is what's sort of physically going on in my body right now. But what I'm trying to really get at is probably some of the risky things that you may have done in your earlier years, whilst you may not be seeing the effects of it currently. There's nothing to say that has sped up, obviously reducing your lifespan, because you're not actively ever tracking your telomere length. You can do tests, you can do cellular aging tests that will look at your telomere length, but to be honest, would anyone really want to have a look at their predictive aging based on their cellular health? It's one of those things that I'd even be conflicted over, regardless of what anti-aging practices are put in place and lifestyle, diet, whatever. That would you really want to know that, okay, well, my cellular age is, if you're 35, that you're now like 50 years of age cellularly, that, okay, well, I've got really another 20 years. And to be honest, then that no matter what practices you put in place, even if you're really trying to slow time in that regard with anti-aging protocols, telomerase, lengthening protocols, that if you're cellularly at 50 and you try and increase obviously to 70, that 70 is really being achieved when you're 50. So knowing that potentially you could have health issues at 50 because of this cellular replication slowing down, do you even want to know that? So we're opening up a can of worms here with this discussion, but this is a layer of complexity that is just not spoken about when it comes to longevity and bodybuilding, that I want guys really thinking about here, that while it may not happen, the cellular aging aspect of physically aging rapidly on the outside is giving you an indication of potentially what you've set yourself up for in your future years. And whilst gaining, 30, 40 pounds of lean tissue in the space of 2 years is extremely impressive, is anyone really going to care when you die at 50 or 45? Probably not.
No.
Really do these things. If these things really matter to you, then amazing. Go full on in on it. Go, if your ambition is IFBB pro bodybuilder, top level, and you've really got what it takes, then brilliant. Everyone pursue their dreams, but know that there is that price to pay, that putting on that level of tissue and increasing aging to that extent does come back to haunt you.
And I just put a note down here as well. So TRT was obviously quite voodoo for a very long time. Now it's becoming a little bit more normalized. Obviously, it's decriminalized. Is it decriminalized in Ireland as well?
Yeah, it's always
TRT,
been
just androgens in general. Yeah.
Androgens in the personal, I guess, possession is decriminalized. Yeah.
Because obviously the hormone clinics over here are gaining more and more popularity, and more people are going through them. When they optimize your hormones, they're not drawing a baseline. They sort of just throw a blanket rule on you. So I've seen individuals who I coach, they're thrown on like 175 milligrams a week, and their testosterone goes up to like 40 nanomolar. And that's almost 3 times their range naturally. So while this is now being accepted as relatively low risk, because TRT on the surface level, which is what most people understand, is quite benign. Okay. We go into this cellular level, which we're discussing today, and they're exposing themselves to these risks, which they'll never be made aware of. And then as a result, if this discussion became more popular, there'd be a whole nother concept to consider. And then, and it's almost, like I said, I don't know how many people are talking about these things at the moment, but if that were to come to fruition, it's like we've gotten over this fear of TRT, but then now there's this other fear which we do need to consider. Because man, like the clinics, there's a blanket rule. Some of the blanket rules are 250 a week, 250 milligrams, and that could put someone through the roof. I've seen people at 60 nanomolar from 250 more. Yeah,
and that comes down to this clinical prescription, and again, just really not paying attention to like individual, I guess, biochemistry. And that's sort of where my belief with TRT is between 20 and 25 nanomole. That is that's TRT. You're putting it to the sort of upper range of physiological. If you need more of that, then you are really, you know, are you really hypogonadal, or is there something seriously wrong with neurochemistry, like what we spoke about? Or is there a level of androgen resistance? We can never rule that out, that the androgen receptor needs more. There is genetic issues with androgen receptor resistance, but TRT really needs to be like individualized in that. Again, going back to what's their natural baseline, what is their I guess metabolism for testosterone? So are they slow, medium, or fast metabolizers? And then tailor the dose to match that. So, you know, really the sort of operating guideline should be, we know 250 milligrams of testosterone yields on average a level of 45 nanomole. So if we half that, we arrive at 125, yielding a level of 20 to 22. So standard protocol should be you start something on 125, run that for 4 or 5 weeks, do a blood draw and see what stable level is chem from 125. If they're a normal metabolizer, we'll expect their level between 20 and 25. If they're a fast metabolizer, their level is probably going to be somewhere in the mid-teens. And if they're a slow metabolizer, their level is going to be somewhere in the 30s. From there, you just adjust the dose depending on, do they need more of the drug? Is it kept the same? Or do they need less of the drug? And what you're trying to do is educate the patient. This is sort of where TRTs become so popular that you go in and get a prescription for 250 milligrams. And all of a sudden you're walking around with a test level of 60. And or you know, 250 giving you a level of 45 on average. You're while you're improving the quality of your life by having this super physiological level of testosterone, you are bringing in the most basic impacts of skewed lipid profile, and now you're getting into the intricacies of what we talked about there with cellular aging. That if you're hypogonadal at a level of say 12, where you are sort of at the clinical guidelines for TRT, and you optimize them to 22 or 25, okay, yes, you've doubled their total testosterone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've doubled their risk of heart disease or doubled their risk of other cellular implications. So you've effectively just giving a controlled measure of a double the amount of testosterone to that patient, whereby the previous hypogonadal level just might not have been enough to engage in androgen receptor activity in the brain for increased dopamine. So their libido now increases, or increased androgen receptor activation in their muscle cells so that there's increased recovery and protein synthesis. But you're doing it in a controlled manner, that you're doing an educated adjustment of, you know, doubling their natural level, as opposed to just going, here's a prescription, go get it done. Who cares where it has you sitting? And that's sort of where medicine is going to start, I guess, falling in line to, is personalized medicine, which is genetics driven and genetic driven prescription. Because I remember reading a paper, it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and it made an educated assumption where it analyzed like a lot of clinical trial data, and came to the conclusion that on average for any prescribed medicine, you've a 23% chance of it likely having an effect, like a correct effect. And that is, again, from, I guess, clinical data being applied to a whole population, as opposed to clinical data being extrapolated and then figuring out, is this the best route for this patient, or does the patient need less, or does the patient need more? And that, again, it comes down to their genetics. So it's definitely a very interesting part of where medicine's going to go, especially when it comes to TRT and how mainstream TRT is becoming. I mean, we only have to look at, like, the FDA coming out 2 weeks ago, was it, in the US, with telemedicine, and really like clamping down on TRT prescriptions being provided to people through telemedicine in the US.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, there's more so the DEA coming in and really trying to make it such a controlled drug that they're really going to make people jump through hoops in order to get TRT therapy in the US.
Yeah, because over
Um,
here it's not very mainstream either. It's just starting to get there, which is why the
yeah,
clinics are more so pushing it through, like your hormone clinics. Yeah, as
yeah.
opposed to because going through a doctor, I think you need to be under 6 nanomolar to you need to be under 6 nanomolar to get it here, which
In
is
the UK, it's under 12
mm,
and has to be consecutive for 6 to 8 months. And you need to have a free testosterone level of less than, I think it's 0.21 of a nanomole as well. So
yeah, ours is 0.2. Our units are different. Yeah, 0.2. Um, and I think it's 3 consecutive blood tests across 6-week breaks, something like that.
very similar. Very
Mm.
similar.
Yeah, because some
And
guys
then
try to get it, and then they sort of tell them how long they have to wait, and they're just like, "Yeah, no." Yeah, and then they just jump in. But even in saying
and
that,
then
like
not
when you get it through a doctor here, they just put you on the undeconate.
that's what I was going to say. Normally
Yeah,
here it resolves to either Nebido, which is like a
yeah,
one
Nebido
shot
it is. Yeah, yeah,
every 8 or 9 weeks, or
mhm.
they prescribe you testosterone gel, which again is just
Yeah. They do the
utterly
gels as well.
useless.
Yeah, because I do know guys.
So
I know guys are going for the Bayer shots once a fortnight, but like you have to go in for it, which is
yeah, that's it.
mm,
It's really controlled, probably very similar pharmaceutical law with the
mm,
Australian and UK that
mm,
you have to have a nurse administer your shot. It's not like, oh, here's your
mm,
prescription, take it home.
yeah. Nah,
Yeah.
exactly like that.
And I mean, I've had these discussions with GPs who are involved with male optimization clinics in the UK of
Mhm,
like why the British Society of Medicine hasn't changed its clinical guidelines
mhm,
to testanante or cypionate, do 2 micro injections per week with a
mhm,
much more stable level as opposed to
mhm,
one shot of Nebido every 9 weeks, where like Nebido basically will spike a 200 milligram, 250 milligram shot of Nebido will spike your level to about 45 in the
mhm,
first 2 days when the
mhm,
drug clears. And then it sustains that level of sort of 45 for like the first 3 days. And then all of a sudden the half-life kicks in by the end of the first week and you're down into the 20s. And effectively you get to a point where from like week 5 to 8, the
mhm,
Nebido shot has your test level sort of at like the 11, 10 nanomole
yeah.
region. So it's
Mhm,
sort of like you've given them such a high to start, and then they've
mhm,
weaned off that when it comes to the last 4 weeks before the
mhm,
next injection. Mentally, in terms of that neurochemistry aspect, their
mhm,
libido's just gone back to where it was when they were
mhm,
hypergonadal. That you're not really, you're giving them 2 or 3 weeks of amazing therapeutic benefit, and you're just putting them back to the same sort of psychological scenario that they were before.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
there's
Nah,
definitely
because sorry, go on.
so there's definitely politics there involved to some extent of why there's really clinical resistance even amongst endocrinologists of why we wouldn't again entertain this hormone level. And I
Mhm,
mean, it comes back to maybe there's a medical stigma.
mhm,
I had a I had a consult before with a man, and he had been admitted to hospital, and he was self-administering TRT,
mhm,
but for some reason the TRT, the testosterone he had received, was completely bunk, or like 1/8 of a dose,
mhm,
because his testosterone level came back at 6 with his FSH and LH suppressed on his blood work.
mhm,
And the doctors within the emergency department turned around to him and said, "Oh, you're taking steroids. You shouldn't be doing that."
mhm.
But the guy was hypogonadal, taking bunk testosterone.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, is that through the clinic?
so no, so this was a guy who just he came to me for a consult, but he had presented to A&E with a health complication, and when he'd done his hormone panel at hospital, LH and FSH were suppressed, but his testosterone level was at 6,
Mm-hmm.
even though he was administering self-prescribed TRT of
Yeah.
125 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
It was only yielding a test level of 6.
Mm-hmm.
And their initial sort of educated responses, "Oh, you need to stop taking that TRT."
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to logically thinking, okay, well, this guy's taking testosterone, but he's severely hypogonadal because what he's taking is fake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they don't want to help him in
So,
that. Yeah, go on.
it just goes to show the level of like even the stigma that's surrounding
Mm-hmm.
the use of TRT, that
Yeah.
here's a guy that is presented with suboptimal testosterone levels, and your first thing to say is, oh, well, you shouldn't be taking TRT. It should really be like, oh, well, by the way, what you're taking is absolutely fake and is doing your body no service.
Yeah. I feel like I'm not surprised by that, because that would be exactly what I would expect. Yeah. Like
sure.
precisely. All right, I might wrap up there, man. Thank you for jumping on. That was the most out of depth I've felt. That was great. That's exactly what I wanted. Yeah, so
I'm glad.
really appreciate that. That's a gold mine for listeners. We appreciate that a lot.
Yeah.
And that's some stuff that would be cool for you to get out there more as well. I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is definitely
Yeah.
something I'm going to start
Mm.
making a point of
Mm.
thought provoking, that
Mm.
just because you're currently healthy,
Mhm.
with some of the practices we've done with competitive bodybuilding and that your future health risk is potentially impacted slightly.
Mhm.
I can't say how much, but knowing how our cells operate, we are effectively influencing our sort of chronological clock towards maybe reduced lifespan, and that, you know, not to be hugely surprised if that catches up with you later in life based on what you've chosen to do earlier. But again, like I said, each to their own. You know, if that's someone's personal goal and what they want to chase after, even what we do as competitive bodybuilders, then that's what our choice was. But not to be naive that there's a I guess a hidden layer to our longevity that we're not really speaking about.
Of course. So just for listeners as well, what were the Instagram handle for yourself and Instagram handle for Supplement Needs?
So my Instagram is Dean STM, DEAN STM, and then Supplement Needs is @supplement_needs. And then we've also got the education site,
Of course.
SN
Yeah.
Education.
Forgot about that. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's somewhere where I'm starting to try and put together content like what we've talked about in terms of like neurotransmission, dopamine's effects in the brain. So that's some of the stuff that's going to be upcoming over the next couple of months once I have it in a easy way to understand for people to then start really thinking about when they're using these compounds.
Yeah, because like I mentioned before, like throughout that's I learned a lot just then. Actually, that was fantastic. Yeah. And yeah, so thank you, and yeah,
Thank you very much.
enjoy.
Thanks for coming on, Dean.